Hello and welcome back to CSC's live chat. I am Sukanya Nair, and today we have a very special session on the State of Africa's Environment Report. And with us, we have Richard Mahapatra today, and it's extremely our privilege and honor to have. He's the managing editor of Down to Earth, and also one of the key voices behind the report. So thank you so much, Richard, for joining us.
Thank you,
Uh,
Sukanya.
all right, I would let's just show them the report.
Yeah.
Congratulations on the third edition of this report. So, Richard, let's start from the very beginning. How did this idea, the State of Africa's Environment Report, how did that idea spark? And how do you decide on what should be the key focus this year? And more importantly, why climate in 2025?
Okay, let me start with this point. Um, there was a critical need
Yeah.
for an annual statement, you can call it, or statement of purpose, or might be just an what do you call an annual evaluation of state of things in the continent of Africa. So there was no continental product like that. So we basically fulfilled that part. So the State of Africa's Environment is an annual publication. It's researched and written by 50 odd scientists, researchers, journalists from across the continent. They come together and make an assessment every year. So it basically forecasts things, give you a state of affairs in a particular domain, and how it helps. It basically helps uh, the policymakers, those who are into the development of African nations, respective nations' planning processes, to equip them with critical informations and knowledge in one place. That basically how the State of Africa's Environment Report is designed as. And as you know, we have been, India has a State of India's Environment Report.
Right.
It's nearly 35 years that has been there, and it has played a critical role. And in case of Africa, it's a continental way of doing things. There are more than 50 countries in the continent. It's very diverse. We just assume it as a continent, that's a one identity. So, but it's done by, as I told you, very eminent group of writers, researchers, scientists, and all this. And coming back to how we choose a theme every year. This is the third year of the annual publication. And how we choose a theme for a particular year is basically what is the most pressing, critical, and important aspects, not of that year, but it's the most pressing one. That's why I'm saying the environment is very critical always. And if you look at it, Africa as a continent, it's the most ecological continent. Its economy, its development parameters, everything is critically linked to state of environment. So if you look at it, nearly 80% of Africa's, the continent's economy is linked to environmental factors. Nearly 90% of the livelihoods come from environmental services. That's basically primarily agriculture and forest. So choosing a theme is basically, that's why I said within this domain of environment, and we actually pick up the pressing aspect. And that actually happens keeping in mind the developments that's happening. So for example, the State of Africa's Environment 2024 was themed around water. So how we actually selected that theme for that year is basically water is a critical. Though Africa seems to be floating with water, it's very rich in water resources, but water is turning out to be a fundamental axis or a deficit that's going to dictate Africa's development. So that's why it was chosen as the theme was water. This year's theme of climate, as you know, climate is everything. And Africa is the most vulnerable continent to climate change in the world. And it's also the most climate risked continent, even though it doesn't contribute anything to this crisis. Its emission is negligible. So saying that this time why we selected to put the theme of the report around climate change or the climate emergency is that, as I told you, it's the most vulnerable, it's the worst victim as well. Look at it. Every third death due to disaster in the world is from Africa. And that has been happening for 50 years.
It's stark data.
That's very startling. And also, if you look at it, now look at it, if you compare the other continents, and Africa is warming faster than the other continents. And being a continent which is completely dependent on the environmental factors, and where the climate or weather related factors play a critical role in its existence, it's also a crippling, uh, what you can say, shock for the continent. That's why the climate theme was picked up. And what we have done within this theme, as I told you, climate is everything. It's political, it's sociological, and when the climate changes, everything changes. The whole planet is going through this crisis, but Africa is more. So we have actually analyzed how the climate change is impacting its food security, the mobility of people, its then its livelihood aspects, then also how the continent is actually gearing up to see that. And why this year the climate, again, I'm reiterating, is that the 5 years starting from 2021 to 25 has been the deadliest 5 years for the continent. It's close to 29,000 deaths due to disasters, weather and climate related disasters. And if you just put it in perspective, yes, the planet never had such a change in the climate or the warming in 800,000 years. But the African continent is going through a change in its climate that seems to be the most rapid, unprecedented, at least in 2000 years. So that's why the theme was actually climate change and how it's actually touching or impacting the overall development of the continent. So it was chosen
We can
as the
say
main.
that Africa is in a state of climate emergency right now.
Yes, it is definitely climate in the climate emergency. And there is not a single person who is not impacted, and more so in the continent of Africa, which is the most ecological continent.
Which are now that sets the stage really well for our next question. So, according to the report's finding, we know that Africa is already the most food insecure continent. But now, over time, we already know, we also have found that it is becoming the most climate mobile nation, sorry, continent, which essentially means that the highest rate of displacement and migration is happening or is being caused by climate change. So, how do you see this unfolding and what are the implications for the continent's future?
To begin with, just let's understand. I'll answer your questions in two parts. First, come to the food security part. Uh, First of all, Africa is actually it's a continent of the smallest farmers. If you look at it, 70% of population of Africa are basically depend on the small and rain-fed farms for survival. Having said that, it's also true that Africa has the highest or the biggest potential for farming. As it is said often and mentioned often that Africa has the potential to feed the whole world
Mm.
if its potential is actually exploited
Mm.
or achieved. But at the same time, if you look at it, Africa has been going through some systemic problem with its agriculture. And as we all know, it's very popular. Let's say that most of the most malnourished, food insecure countries are on the African continent. Having said that, if this is the situations where actually climate emergency strikes hard, as I already told you, means if you happen, if you are a continent which is dependent on climate related services, and the climate changes, then everything changes. So does the food security also is deeply impacted by climate emergency, and particularly in the continent which is already highly food insecure, despite having the potential to feed the mm, whole planet. Let me put it, if you look at it, during 1990 and 2015, so in 25 years, the climate factors or the changes caused by the climate change has already taken out 12% of the continent's GDP. And around 70% of the continent's GDP is contributed by agriculture and forestry and other environmental sectors. So you can imagine how hard it is hitting now. Just to give you it's there are studies which show clearly that 2-degree warming, which is a very much a possibility, and might be the continent is on the way to actually around that kind of warming in near futures. 50% of the continent's population will be malnourished. So the production of food, access to food, and the intake of food, everything is going to be impacted. That's why, every second person in the continent will be malnourished. If you go, if the
Substantial.
warming, yeah, it's very substantial. And in fact, it's not only substantial, it's the highest forecast we are seeing it among the continents. And by this time, what has happened, 40% of the soils are already going through degradations and aridity. It's drying up. So the potential actually to hold agriculture, there is a fundamental actually threat there. 40% soil drying up and degrading, then what will you do? That's the kind of impact its climate emergency is having there. And what it means is it could lead to up to 20% decline in agriculture. If the warming continues and the way the climate change is happening. And if you go by another aspect, as you know, when climate changes, everything changes. So what's happening due to warming, erratic weather, and all these things are leading to also outbreak of diseases. And the diseases also strike the plants, the crops. Scientists are already talking in terms of a plant pandemic. Crops after crops are being infected by insects.
We've been seeing that over the
Yeah,
years.
we are seeing
News
that.
and
In
news.
fact, if you go by in the last 10 years, if you look at it, and it's not defined, there is no term for it, but safely you can say that at least 30 countries in Africa have declared emergency due to crop insects
Mutation.
actually impacting the
Outbreaks.
crops.
Right.
It's that much wide. And you can see that at any point of time, one outbreak is there. And when it happening in multiple countries, the same insect, same disease, that's why you call it a pandemic. The same way we call it a COVID a pandemic and all these things. So the food security will be actually majorly impacted now. It's being impacted, and it's happening in a continent that's already food insecure to a significant level. And we are already seeing that climate is unfolding that scenario rather sooner than expected. Now, coming to your next part is the migration or displacement. Globally, I'll tell you, means what's happening in 2018. We know this, that, most of the displacement or the migration happened due to war, conflicts, the large scale migration and mobility of displacement people happened due to that.
Because we understand that climate change is obviously not the sole factor which is leading to
Yes,
migration.
but there is a historic change happening now. Since 2018, the agencies that monitor migration and displacement across the world saw a change. War and conflicts are no more the main reasons for actually displacing people or triggering migration. And remember, most of this migration is inside the country, but people are being displaced from their place of residence. And what is it, the new region? The new region is basically the climate related factors or weather related factors, basically the disasters. So that's the global. But in case of Africa, it's the same. But there is a double whammy in case of Africa. Africa has also long history of conflicts in many countries. And they have also large scale migration or displacement happening due to conflicts. Now we get to see that the conflicts hotspots are also the climate hotspots. So climate change is adding.
I was seeing there was this interesting data that internal displacement in Africa has been triple the size in the last from 2009 to 2023.
Yes.
And that's again because of both the reasons, conflict and
Yes, what you
climate change.
see, it's first, more and more disasters happening. As Endo pointed out, every third death in the world due to disasters
happening in Africa.
Africa. Then also more and more disasters like that last 5 years have been very devastating. And these are all extreme. So they are only causing the uh, mm, displacement of people, like drought, very severe drought. Then you have floods, storms, and mostly floods are happening in a big way. So those things are there. Now the climate comes and the conflict. So we see that in the conflict areas, the impact is much more. Already people are displaced in that situation, and climate emergency is adding to that. So we have examples. People are spending more and more time being displaced. Sometimes even it goes up to more than a year kind of things.
This migration in itself is becoming an adaptation strategy.
Yes, I think, if you look at it, it's migration is accepted as an adaptation things. But where do you migrate? How often do you migrate? What will you do in your new place of things? There are conflicts arising out of that also. That's also leading to humanitarian crisis, outbreak of diseases, uncertainty of tenure, and all these things are happening. So currently, if you look at it, in the last 5 years, 220 million people were impacted by weather. And we assume that most of them were also displaced. So if this continues like this, and if you look at the data from last 15 years, the displacement due to disasters has gone up by 6 times. And climate related regions are being attributed for this thing. So in a continent having many countries where conflicts were the key region for displacement and migration or human mobility, post mobility, climate emergency comes in. And just to sum it up, just to give a sense of how big will be. Uh, remember, Africa is the youngest continent.
Yes, correct.
The median age is around 20 years.
19 point something.
19.8 or something. That's around 20 years. It means that 50% of the continent's population are below that and 50% above. And if you look at it from the climate forecast, as you said, in this forecast will happen around 2030, 2020, 50% of the young population, means the year below 20 years, are going to live another 2, 3, 4 decades, at least 3 decades kind of thing going by the life expectancy. They'll be growing up actually in a completely maligned climate. And a climate emergency just triggering mobility. Large scale migration is happening now. So 50% of populations of Africa will be actually vulnerable or at risk of being displaced due to climate emergency. And there is a figure for it. There is an estimate that by 2050, in the business as usual scenario, means as we go by the current warming and all these things happening, 5% of population of 2 billion will be on the move due to climate change in the continent. So that's why it's not only the youngest continent, it will be the also the most mobile continent in the next 25 years due to climate change. And that brings in lots of uncertainties.
It also brings me to another Save the Children had come up with a report which
Mhm.
basically said that a child born in 2020 will be more exposed or experience significantly more extreme weather events in comparison to someone who was born in 1960, which itself is worrying.
Yeah, it's true, and it's true for Africa also. It's that if you are born in 2020, according to that Save the Children study, you will be witnessing more droughts, you will be witnessing more wildfire, you will be witnessing more
Floods.
floods, more storms. So here the comes the question of mm, the first generation of the 21st century. That's the first 20 years, if you look at it, and if you apply and believe in this intergenerational justice principle, what they call, we just inherited
The
a
climate
planet and
injustice.
we borrowed it from the past, the future generations. We have not done that. So the current generations doesn't have any experience of what a normal planet looked like, what a normal weather looked like, what a normal climate looked like. Rather, they inherit a planet, a situations that's basically doesn't uh, what even allow them to be normal, and they face huge risk of food insecurity, huge risk of settlement. They will be unsettled. Like as we just looked at the data from Africa, if 50% of 5% of populations are going to be on the move, what do you expect?
Let's moving on, one thing that I should probably say, it's not all that grim. The good thing that is coming out of all of this is that African nations, and most of them, have some form of adaptation strategy or an initiative in place right now. And if you, I mean, it'll be great if you could cite some example of some innovation or ambitious adaptive initiatives you've seen across Africa, which I think is a positive spin to all of this.
Yeah, I think as you say that sometimes I think it's not only sometimes climate is all about adapting to climate changes. That's no other way to do it. Mitigation, yes, that's a long-term things, and the world is struggling with that. And for a continent that contributes the least is the worst victim, and it continues to be like that. But there are really beautiful examples from the most difficult geographies on the planet. That's the continent of Africa, uh, which gives you hope that the continent, the countries in the continent are actually have mm, rising to the occasion and saying that okay, we need to adapt. Yeah, migration definitely is not is a desired adaptation things, but there are other things. Before that, let's look at how Africa is positioned. The countries in Africa, African continent, needs around $2.8 trillion by 2030 to implement its climate plans as they have drafted. And out of this, only 24% is earmarked for adaptations. They have identified the risk They have put the cost. So, and how to fight it, adaptation, how to adapt to the climate emergency. So that's only 24% of the that need that's out of the $2.8 trillion need is earmarked for adaptations. But it's not necessary that they have the money. So there is a huge what even a gap for what they need and whether what kind of resources the African countries have. So there is a huge gap for that. So rather they are crippled. They don't have the resources also to do that. So that's the overall situation. Now coming to in these situations, in this emergency time when it's the most vulnerable, there are countries actually. Not as there is not a single country which has not adopted a climate plan, first of all. Second, there are actually countries which are it's more than a quarter of century ago started.
Right.
Like, give me this example to begin with the first Namibia.
Mm.
25 years ago, it had actually a national committee on climate change.
That's actually big.
Yeah,
To 25 years ago when we were still.
exactly. To advise the policymakers and the leadership in the country to how the climate change will impact and how to fight it. And if you look at it, Namibia now, Namibia is big. As we know, Namibia, it's arid, semi-arid. That's the complete geography of that. It's big on water conservation and harvesting. It's big on natural, regenerative, natural farming.
Have been a process that where they have built
Yes,
systems.
and they have actually have taken up. It's basically as a part of their climate adaptation things. And its impacts could be seen also as this report has detailed it out. Communities are successful in now to fight a severe drought, to fight a storm, and food security is also increasing. So that is Namibia. Another example could be look at Cameroon.
Cameroon seems like a very interesting study considering how they have transformed a refugee camp to.
Exactly. So as you see it, migrations and intercountry migrations and due to conflicts in other regions is very high in answers. And one, I think the in the report, the story is that it says that Cameroon's fight for climate change starts from a refugee camp.
Yes.
So this camp basically gets thousands of refugees from a neighboring country. But what they did, they turned them into a climate adaptation center.
Mm.
So Cameroon's economy is wholly dependent on part agriculture,
Mhm.
part forest, and also it needs timber
Mhm.
for fuel. So what they did is that you just don't plant,
Mm.
you regenerate the whole landscape. Because planting doesn't matter when your land is drying, you are degrading, so you have to regenerate that. So that's one refugee camp experience of how to regenerate a
Complete.
small, geography. Basically guides Cameroon's national adaptation plan.
See
Where,
Cameroon.
yeah,
Yeah.
where it's basically go that, okay, we will have a completely ecosystem approach to it. We'll regenerate the ecosystems. And when you regenerate the ecosystem, you regenerate the forest, then the economy picks up, then also the involved community in that.
Mm.
And they actually bring in a sustainable trade, the indigenous way of using the forest.
Mm.
So that's Cameroon. And Cameroon's, experience is also a decade old. And we have examples. We saw that clearly, in case of the food security is being assured, because mostly the food, actually the forest provides you year-round food security.
Mhm.
So various, every month you will have some things collect from the forest and you get it. So they are basically recreating their old ecology.
I think the story of Congo is also very similar in that way because they are also involving the communities and the women that just like in India, how women do not have their own assets, they
Mhm.
have involved women and so that they also have some sort of financial stability and So I thought the case of DRC is also very
Yeah, I think
interesting.
the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, is also unique. First of all, it's right inside a planetary ecological system that we all celebrate.
Mm.
Forest and forest and forest perennial. That's why probably, I mean, arguably, the oldest forest you have. But also remember, Congo is one of those worst 10 countries vulnerable and risked
Right.
by climate change. And it faces all problems like sea level rise,
Mhm.
the floods, drought, and biodiversity degradation. And for a country that you can say safely 100% depend on biodiversity, degradation of biodiversity is basically fatal. So now with the climate change happening, all this degradation is basically it's faster degradation, sea level is rising. Then you have, floods are becoming very
More intense and frequent.
intense and frequent. And so how they do is basically it's again regenerating its forest.
Mm.
So it's the same equivalent, but with some changes. They are putting actually community in charge of the
Mhm.
forest regenerations. They are actually creating pockets of wealth, pockets of what you can economic activities they are drafting and putting the community in charge, saying that
Mhm. Now you take
you
care of it.
protect, regenerate, you use the resources,
Mm.
and that's how you will be actually fighting climate change.
That gives them a
And
sense of ownership and
yeah, ownership. Like as you pointed out, the ownership of women on land or assets, like in India, that's there everywhere. It's
Mhm.
women put in the most work but don't own it.
Mhm.
So they are taking actually that systemic change in that also. So one way, that's the example that we have got till now, the Namibia, the Cameroon, and Congo specifically. These are also societal and regime change while the fighting the climate change. So so that's another example. Congo, where we are actually seeing that changes are happening, and there are many examples in Congo where the forest has been regenerated back, and economic uh, benefits are being also reaped.
right.
So communities are actually reporting up to 10 to 20% increase in earning,
Mm.
while at the same time the food security,
It's also gotten
yeah, because the access to the food
impact.
sources in a forest that's now you are managing is also there. So they are better equipped to fight uh, external shock
With the
events
access
like
to resources. Yeah.
floods or any climate weather events.
Shall we go to the final question?
And I'll just, before I think I'll just give you another example of Madagascar. I think Madagascar, everybody would love to
Yes.
go there. Everybody knows it also. It's the most biodiverse country. So they are actually, fishing is a big activity, but weather is changing. Climate has changed. It's no more that normal sea, so you go for fishing and all that. So Madagascar, in its climate adaptations program, has given priority to early warning,
Okay.
not only of climate, of where to get the fish, so that you venture with all the warning, the
Mhm.
meteorological warnings, and also to know that where exactly fish are there, so that you can target it. Because remember, due to climate change, these oceans are also warming. So, like the human, there is a huge mobility among in the fish and
Fish.
other in the sea.
Just generally
So yeah, so
biodiversity is
that's how
taken.
Madagascar is planning.
Let's go to the final question. I mean, the stats have been grim, but we also heard so many positive stories from across African nation. But how can Africa's adaptation initiative, how can we scale it so that we can ensure that the continent is not just surviving, but also, leading the whole climate solution?
See, first of all, if you look at it, Africa is the only continent which is a continental approach to
Hmm.
not only climate change adaptations, but also to, its prime sector like the agriculture. You have a history of 40 years, the continent actually talking in terms of a continent and its crisis. Agriculture, we have seen this. You will see this, continental or intercontinental trade agreements and all these things. But Africa is unique in that way. It has its climate also adaptations.
Right.
And also, as I told you, the agriculture, particularly its prime source of survival.
Not in
It,
silos. We are looking at
it's a
it.
continental approach to it. Coming back to, scaling up. Yes, there are, examples are emerging, small examples. Those need to be actually scaled up to a national scales. But at the continental level, they are working on the plans and policies and approach so that, all of them can together come and do this. There is a challenge of each of these successful examples. It's lessons being learned and being upscaled. I think we have already seen in Namibia. Then Congo is an example, which is basically they adopt it as a national plan. So it's in the process now.
Right.
So if you look at it, it's in a transitions when whatever they have been experimenting and doing it, African countries are now have started scaling up to the national level. And by saying that also, there is, you cannot have just a single one, what do you call, a strategy to fight climate change. As you know, climate is the most globalized local crisis. It differs, its impact differs from village to village. So many countries are in the process of drafting local plans, but supported by national policy for climate adaptations. So we are looking at many of these, very well crafted, decentralized, very targeted climate adaptation strategies that evolving out of Africa.
We can probably say that although climate emergency may be a global issue, but most of these resilience, we can learn from Africa that the resilience has always been local.
Yeah.
And from there, I think the world should learn from it, that how they have dealt with it.
Exactly.
Right.
So the example of, that refugee camp
Of course.
in Cameroon.
All right. With that, we come to the end of today's live chat. Richard, thank you so much for explaining to us in detail about, not just the findings, and also sharing your insight about each of the nation. And for the viewers, if you're interested to read the report, it's available. The State of India, sorry, State of India's Environment Report is also available, but the State of Africa's Environment Report, which we published just this month, is available at cseindia.org. Just check out our publication and it's right there. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and we'll be back soon with the next episode. Until then, bye bye.